Back on the plane, the atmosphere had grown even more tense. The young woman with the phone couldn't shake the uneasy feeling spreading through her chest. Her fingers hovered over the airline's app, debating whether to send an alert. "Do you think they're checking the baggage?" she asked her seatmate, her voice low. "What if someone smuggled something on board?" Her seatmate shifted nervously. "Or worse," they murmured, not daring to finish the thought. At the front of the plane, one of the flight attendants was speaking in hushed tones to the captain. "I don't know what's happening, but the passengers are panicking," she whispered. "Do you think we should do a sweep, just in case?" The captain frowned but nodded. "We can't take any chances." Meanwhile, the officer outside the plane straightened, his instincts on high alert. He stepped out of the room, motioning for another officer to join him. "We need to search the plane," he ordered. As he headed toward the jet bridge, the elderly woman called after him. "You're running out of time," she warned, her tone eerily calm. Suddenly, a crackling noise came through his radio. "We've got something," a voice said, tense and clipped. "It's not what we expected." The officer's breath caught, his pace quickening as he headed toward the plane. Whatever was about to unfold, it was bigger than anyone had realized. The officer rushed back to the plane, heart pounding as the words from his radio played on a loop. "We've got something." He stepped onto the aircraft, scanning the cabin as passengers fell silent, their anxious faces turning toward him. The flight attendants stood near the cockpit, pale and wide-eyed. One pointed to an overhead compartment near the middle of the plane. "It's in there," she whispered. He approached cautiously, his hand hovering near his holster. Another officer was already there, carefully pulling down a carry-on bag. The passengers leaned forward, straining to see what was happening. The officer unzipped the bag slowly, revealing something that made the entire plane gasp. Stacks of what looked like classified documents, neatly bound and marked with high-level government seals. The young woman with the phone whispered, "Is this some kind of espionage?" Her seatmate nodded, their jaw dropping. The officer felt a cold sweat break out as he processed the discovery. This wasn't just a safety threat. It was something much larger, something that could have national security implications. He turned to the elderly woman, who had been brought back onto the plane under tight supervision. She stood calmly, her expression unchanged. "It's not mine," she said simply, but her voice carried weight. "But I knew it was here." The officer narrowed his eyes. "Then how did you know about it?" She sighed, looking around at the sea of confused and frightened faces. "I was supposed to deliver it," she admitted, "years ago, but I refused, and they've been trying to use me ever since." This was their way of framing me, making it look like I finally caved. She paused, her voice steady. "Someone else brought it on board, hoping I'd take the blame." Before he could respond, another officer stepped forward, holding up a small listening device they'd found taped under a seat. The elderly woman's gaze hardened. "That's their insurance," she said. "They're watching us right now." A ripple of fear swept through the cabin as the realization sunk in. The officer clenched his fists, knowing the danger was far from over. Just as he started to issue orders, the radio crackled again. "We've identified a second suspect," the voice said urgently, "and they're still on the plane." The room seemed to freeze, and everyone turned to each other, the tension reaching its peak. The officer locked eyes with the elderly woman. "Who?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Her answer was chilling. "The one who never speaks." The officer scanned the plane, his eyes darting over the passengers. Everyone looked at one another nervously, whispering and shifting in their seats. "The one who never speaks," the elderly woman had said, her voice calm yet ominous. He turned back to her, his voice low but firm. "Who are you talking about?" She motioned subtly toward a man sitting in the last row, his face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. The officer signaled for backup, and two officers approached quietly. The man didn't move, didn't flinch, even as they stood over him. "Sir," one of the officers said firmly, "we need you to come with us." The man finally looked up, his expression blank, but his eyes sharp. Without a word, he stood and allowed himself to be escorted off the plane. As he passed the elderly woman, their eyes met briefly. She gave him a small, knowing nod, one that seemed to unsettle him. Outside, the officers searched him and discovered a hidden compartment in his carry-on containing what appeared to be a sophisticated device. It didn't take long for experts to confirm it was meant to erase data, likely targeting the classified documents found earlier. The man's silence only deepened the mystery, but the evidence spoke louder than words. Back on the plane, the elderly woman sat quietly, her composure unshaken despite everything. The officer returned to her, shaking his head in disbelief. "How did you know?" he asked, almost in awe. She gave a faint smile. "Sometimes, life gives you a front-row seat to things you'd rather not see," she said. "You learn to recognize the patterns." As the flight finally prepared for takeoff, the officer escorted her to a seat near the front. "You saved a lot of people today," he said, his tone sincere. She nodded but didn't respond. Her gaze drifted out the window, where the man was being led away in handcuffs. The tension was gone, but the mystery of her life lingered. Who was she really? And how much had she seen in her lifetime? As the plane took off, the passengers exhaled in collective relief, carrying with them a story they'd never forget. The hum of the airplane cabin was interrupted by the crackle of an intercom announcement and the faint sound of commotion in the back. Passengers exchanged curious glances as a police officer, stern-faced and uniformed Chris, stepped onto the plane. His eyes scanned the rows, locking on an older woman sitting quietly by the window. The scene felt surreal. An officer boarding a plane to make an arrest? Of all people, why an elderly woman? The officer's voice was firm as he addressed her. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me." Gasps rippled through the cabin, and the once ordinary flight transformed into something straight out of a movie. The old woman, frail but composed, turned her calm eyes toward him. A soft murmur rose among the passengers, many whispering to each other, speculating about what she could have possibly done. She stood, her movements slow yet deliberate, and met the officer's gaze. Her silence added to the weight of the moment. As she walked toward the front of the plane, escorted by the officer, someone from the back couldn't hold back and blurted, "What's going on? She's just an old lady." Others chimed in, their outrage growing louder. Then, just as the tension reached its peak, the elderly woman paused and turned back to face the crowd. Her voice, steady and clear, cut through the noise. She said one sentence, just one, and the entire cabin fell silent. Even the officer hesitated, his expression shifting. Passengers sat frozen, some in shock, others with tears welling in their eyes. What could she have said that left everyone speechless? Why was this old woman being arrested in the first place? And how did one sentence change everything in an instant? Stay with us as we unravel this unbelievable story that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about the situation. The cabin was eerily quiet as the elderly woman's words lingered in the air. Faces that had been filled with outrage moments before now showed confusion, curiosity, and even guilt. No one dared to speak, their minds racing to piece together what was happening. The officer, who had been so confident in his approach, now seemed hesitant, his grip on her arm loosening just slightly. As the pair made their way off the plane, murmurs began again, but this time they were softer, tinged with uncertainty. "Did you hear what she said?" One man whispered to his seatmate. "What could she mean?" Another woman muttered, shaking her head. No one had an answer, and the mystery only deepened. A flight attendant, visibly shaken, approached the remaining passengers. She tried to regain control of the situation, offering reassurance that the flight would resume shortly. But it was clear her own thoughts were elsewhere, her eyes darting to the open door where the woman and the officer had disappeared. Meanwhile, outside the plane, the officer led the elderly woman down the jet bridge. Her steps were steady, and her expression was unreadable. It wasn't defiance or fear. It was something much harder to place. She didn't argue, didn't resist. She just walked, her presence somehow commanding respect despite the circumstances. Who was this woman? To the passengers, she seemed like any other grandmother, quiet, unassuming, perhaps on her way to visit family. But clearly, there was more to her story. What had prompted such a dramatic turn of events? And what was so powerful about her single sentence that it silenced a plane full of strangers? The officer guided her into a small holding area, closing the door behind them. "Let's talk," he said, his tone softer now, almost uncertain. She sat down, clasping her hands in her lap, and finally looked up at him. "You don't understand," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But you will." And with those words, the mystery only grew. The officer leaned back in his chair, studying the elderly woman. Something about her demeanor didn't match the situation. Most people in her position would be flustered, panicked, or defensive, but she was calm, too calm. It made him uneasy. He cleared his throat and asked, "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" "Start from the beginning." The woman gave a faint smile, as though she had expected the question but wasn't sure how much she wanted to reveal. "Sometimes, the beginning isn't where the truth lies," she said cryptically. Her eyes drifted to the window, where she could see the plane still parked on the tarmac. "Do you know how often people look, but they don't see?" The officer frowned, unsure where she was going with this. "Ma'am, I'm trying to help you here, but I need straight answers." She sighed, as though the weight of the world rested on her frail shoulders. "Straight answers. Fine." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You're here because someone made a call. Someone thought I was a problem. But I'm not the problem. The problem is still out there, sitting comfortably on that plane." The officer blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean? Are you saying there's someone dangerous on board?" His hand instinctively moved toward his radio. "I'm saying," she replied slowly, "that not everything is as it seems. But you won't find what you're looking for by treating me like a criminal." Back on the plane, passengers were still buzzing with theories. Some believed the woman must have been a fugitive with a hidden past, while others thought it might be a case of mistaken identity. One young woman, sitting near where the elderly passenger had been, pulled out her phone and scrolled through news alerts, hoping for a clue. But there was nothing, no mention of an arrest, no breaking news that matched the scene unfolding in front of them. The tension was palpable, and every second that passed only deepened the mystery. The passengers weren't the only ones in the dark. Even the officer began to question if he'd been pulled into something far bigger than he could understand. The officer stared at the elderly woman, her words rattling in his mind. "The problem is still on that plane." His pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of it. She didn't seem like someone trying to throw suspicion off herself. Her tone was too measured, her eyes too knowing. Yet, if she wasn't the threat, why had someone reported her? "Who, ma'am?" he'd pressed, lowering his voice. "If there's someone dangerous, I need to know now." She held his gaze for a long moment before responding, her voice steady but heavy with meaning. "It's not about who you think they are. It's about what they're carrying." The cryptic answer made his stomach churn. What could she possibly mean? Contraband, a weapon. He stood abruptly, pacing the small room as the gravity of the situation hit him. If her words were true, the real danger might still be on board, surrounded by unsuspecting passengers. But why hadn't she spoken up sooner? Why hadn't she alerted someone instead of quietly taking the fall? On the plane, the tension was reaching its breaking point. A passenger in the back row stood, his movements abrupt. "I'm sorry, but we deserve answers," he shouted, his frustration spilling over. The flight attendants tried to calm him down, but the atmosphere was thick with suspicion. Everyone seemed to be second-guessing their neighbor, glancing at each other with wary eyes. The young woman with the phone leaned toward the person beside her. "Do you think she meant someone planted something on this plane?" she whispered. Her companion frowned, the idea dawning on him like a chilling revelation. "I don't know, but what if she's right? What if we're all in danger and don't even know it?" Meanwhile, outside the plane, the officer grabbed his radio. He knew he had to act quickly, but the lack of clear information was a minefield. "I need backup at Gate 7, he said, his voice tense. He glanced at the elderly woman, who hadn't moved, her hands still calmly folded in her lap. You better start talking, ma'am. If there's a threat, you need to give me more. She smiled faintly, her next words sending a chill down his spine. You've already seen it. You just don't know it yet. The officer froze, her words echoing in his mind. You've already seen it. You just don't know it yet. His hand tightened on the radio as a sense of unease washed over him. He replayed every detail in his mind, boarding the plane, scanning the rows of passengers, the calm way she stood to follow him. Had he missed something? Was there a clue hiding in plain sight? He crouched slightly, meeting her eyes. I need specifics. What have I seen? What aren't you telling me? His voice was firm, but there was a hint of desperation now. She tilted her head, studying him like a teacher waiting for a student to catch up. You're asking the wrong questions, she replied softly. It's not about what you saw, it's about what you didn't notice.